right, go. Good morning, everyone. We are going to give it just another minute while we wait for our attendees to join, and then we will get started. Good morning, everyone. I am Rear Admiral Araojo, the Associate Commissioner for Minority Health and Director of the FDA's Office of Minority Health and Health Equity. And I am truly delighted to join you today as one of the moderators and welcome you to the Leaning In webinar. This webinar series was developed by the Multi-Regional Clinical Trials Center, or MRCT, and provides practical approaches to improving diversity in clinical trials as based on MRCT's recently released Achieving Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity in Clinical Research document and framework. Working to advance clinical trial diversity is, of course, a key priority for my office and the FDA, and I had the opportunity to also serve on the leadership team of the MRCT Diversity Work Group. Next slide, please. So for our session today, just a couple background information and some housekeeping remarks. Of course, disclaimer for today is that the views expressed are those of the speakers and do not imply endorsement or reflect the views or policies of the FDA or the affiliated organization or entity. The individuals here today are serving in their individual capacity. Next slide. So today's webinar is the 6th of 7 planned sessions. Previous webinars and presentations are available on the MRCT website, and this session will also be posted following the meeting today. And we welcome you to use the chat function to message with the other participants And please make sure that you use the Q&A function on the Zoom platform to submit questions for today's speakers. And we'll of course have our Q&A session at the end of all of the presentations. Next slide. So as you are aware, today's webinar is focused on stakeholder roles and responsibilities. And I'm joined by my co-moderator, Dr. David Strauss, as well as two guest speakers, Dr. Chris Reddick and Dr. Fabian Sandoval. Dr. Strauss is Senior Advisor to the Mrct Center and Director of Research Operations and Compliance at the Columbia University Department of Psychiatry and the NYS Psychiatric Institute, where he oversees human and animal research ethics, regulatory affairs, and core research facilities. He also co-chairs Columbia University Standing Committee on the Conduct of Research. He practices psychotherapy and psychopharmacology and teaches lectures and consults on a range of different areas, including, of course, human subjects protections and applied research and professional ethics. And of course, as Dr. Strauss will highlight, he was also on the Mrct leadership team for their diversity work group. Our other speaker today is Dr. Chris Reddick. He is the Vice President and Head of R&D Health Equity at Takeda Pharmaceuticals. He is a medical scientist by training and has spent over 20 years working in the healthcare industry to address the global challenges of health equity and access to quality healthcare. Chris is also co-founder and chief strategist of Healthcare Partners for Access, which is a nonprofit organization that connects healthcare companies, public health organizations, and nonprofits and academic institutions to help strengthen healthcare systems in underserved communities. And our other speaker is Dr. Fabian Sandoval. He is CEO and Research Director of Emerson Clinical Research Institute and has over 25 years of bench-to-bedside research experience. His diversified research career has been in academia, healthcare systems, and the public sector. He also started the Emerson Community Clinic, which I had the opportunity to visit. It is a clinic that supports uninsured patients across the DC metro area, as well as the Emerson Diversity Health Foundation, whose mission is to educate patients and providers on the importance of participating in clinical research. Dr. Sandoval is also the Emmy-winning host of To Salud, To Familia, and medical contributor to Telemundo. We are so delighted to have all of our distinguished speakers with us today and really look forward to an engaging and interactive conversation. And now I'm going to turn it over to my co-moderator, Dr. Strauss.
Hi, everybody, and good morning. And thank you, Richardae. If I could make one correction, I'm actually, the bio was apparently old. So the research administrative positions that you mentioned at Columbia are no longer ones that I'm active in. And actually I retired from that several years ago now. So I am faculty at Columbia, and I think that's why the affiliation is listed. But with that correction in hand, let me say that I'm delighted here to talk about the diversity project at the Mrct, and to say that a good deal of our focus was understanding the individual roles and responsibilities of stakeholders in the clinical research enterprise. A good deal of work by background went into understanding challenges and impediments to the diversification of research populations. And we recognized early on that identifying the unique contributions and the joint responsibilities of the various stakeholders was critical in in the field forward. Next slide. Let me take a moment to introduce the Mrct. In addition to what Richardae said a moment ago, our overall purpose and vision is to improve the integrity, safety, and rigor of global clinical trials. And we do that through the development of standards, by establishing best practices for clinical research and clinical trials globally, by improving transparency, and that's a core principle that we support and try to disseminate, and by identifying other opportunities for improvement. The Mrct Center accomplished these things through the process of engaging a diverse group of stakeholders, case-specific, to define the emerging issues in global clinical trials and to create and implement ethical, actionable and practical solutions. Next slide. Now, the MRCT Research Ethics Collaborative convened a little over 3 years ago and began thinking about diversity in clinical trials. And in part, that discussion was in response to and motivated by a recently disseminated and publicized drug trial snapshot report produced by the FDA, which captured a cross-section of the participants in clinical trials that were approved, drugs that were approved for market in the preceding year. And what it revealed was an astonishing, but not terribly surprising, lack of diversity. Certainly this last year, 2020, has brought to the fore public's concerns and science's concerns about the inclusion of individuals from traditionally understudied backgrounds in clinical research. We all witnessed the data on COVID-19, and this bar graph demonstrates, for example, the vastly increased mortality rates among Latino, Black, Indigenous populations, and Pacific Islanders compared to white and Asian participants. This gave rise to a call for aggressive efforts to improve the representativeness of clinical trials so that we can learn about and understand the reasons for this kind of healthcare disparity. Next. In spite of the recognition of this kind of disparity, early efforts in the recruitment of people for the next please for the COVID clinical trials revealed again significant disproportionality in the clinical trials and an underrepresentation of ethnic and racial minorities in particular. In fact, though, the updated data and the data from the completed COVID trials, certainly Pfizer and Moderna, demonstrated significant success in recruiting individuals from racial, ethnic, minority backgrounds and other underrepresented groups. And rather than it serving as an exception that proves the rule of underrepresentation, I think it's important to demonstrate that diverse recruitment with concerted effort, and maybe in the face of significant public scrutiny, is possible. Next slide. So in this context, the MRCT developed and released in the fall of this year a guidance document. The leadership of the guidance team included Richardae, who we've met, Barbara Beer, who heads up the initiative, Luther Clark from Merck, Melina Lolik from the FDA, and Sarah White, who's the executive director of the MRCT. But the work was the product of the contributions of over 50 working group members, which included representatives from patient advocacy and patient groups, academia, the pharmaceutical industry, contract research organizations, non-for-profits, trade organizations, government agencies, and research institutes. We felt that it took more than a village, but maybe a small civilization to accumulate the necessary wisdom and creative ideas to try to move the needle on improving representation. Next slide. So the MRCT guidance document, which is available online, is the product of contributions and consensus of a diverse multi-stakeholder working group. It provides practical and actionable recommendations. So if you're interested in a how-to, you can be directed to a particular section that can guide you, your colleagues, your institution on how to actually accomplish some of the changes you may be interested in. There is an accountability section which considers how each stakeholder can change the paradigm. And I'll be focusing on that topic from a fairly high level today, and then introduce our guest speakers who will be talking about some on the ground frontline experiences within their institute and company. And then finally, the guidance document has a rich and extensive toolkit which consolidates unique and adaptable resources for use by all stakeholders. Next slide. I'm going to use the word inclusion really almost synonymously with the idea of diversity to point out that analysis of group differences in safety and efficacy of the kind that we're looking for here, that kind of analysis among diverse populations can promote identification of both underlying biological factors and socially relevant factors that affect health, the social determinants of health. So it's a matter of both good science and social justice to include diverse populations, whether we're talking about age, race, sex, gender identity, and other comorbidities, disability. The notion is inclusion gives rise to better science and better ethics. And that's where the notion of beneficence comes in. Diversity helps optimize the knowledge to be gained from research. Diversity and inclusion also seek to optimize fairness in the distribution of the benefits of research. And that's responsive to the ethical principle of justice. Again, the idea that people who aren't included in research can not clearly benefit from the results of that research is true to a point, but certainly it's necessary if we're going to learn about what are the factors that contribute to healthcare disparity. We need to involve the people who are often excluded from that process. And then finally, in this kind of context, diversity and inclusion build public trust in research and in healthcare. In addition to COVID, certainly 2020 was a year with heightened attention to matters of racism and discrimination and the need for attention to systemic deficiencies, systemic racism, and other such problems in the Black Lives Matter movement, for example. And the idea that a more inclusive research enterprise would serve to build public trust is an important overreaching principle here. As they say, research should be of the people, by the people, and for the people. Next slide. When we talk about stakeholders, we're talking about all the unique but interdependent contributors to research. On the one hand, we're talking about, let's say, 8 in the morning, participants, advocates, and communities. At 1 o'clock, we're talking about industry and research sponsors, other sponsors and funders, like government agencies. The CROs who translate the research into action are critical in the process of addressing diversity, as are study sites and research institutes, the research teams that they engage, and the healthcare professionals who are often at the interface between the scientists and the potential participants in research studies. Also, of course, regulatory agencies, journal editors each play a critical role in either supporting or not the movement toward diversity and inclusion. And then IRB and ethics committees, we argue, provide a really vital role in advancing the interests of ethics and fairness in clinical research. At a very high level, I would say that stakeholders are obligated to understand the case for diversity and understand how diversity matters within their institution, within the particular mission that they have, and how diversity can be translated and understood by that entity in a way that influences the behavior from top down. Understanding the case for diversity might mean developing a business case so you understand how it serves your bottom line. But there may be other internal motivations. It may simply be the notion that it's the right thing to do. And I'll say increasingly, again, amid the changes of 2020, we hear individuals and institutions talk about the notion that inclusion is simply the right thing to do. But sometimes more concrete motivations are necessary within an institution. Secondly, is this notion of ownership and responsibility. And one of the impediments, of course, to making change is the idea that individual entities may not think that it is their job to make the change. Often what we're talking about is a change in a process that's taken place for a long time. We've always done it this way. But ownership and taking responsibility for change is critical. So, for example, a CRO could say, well, we would recruit diverse populations if the industry's sponsors simply requested it of us, is a kind of lack of ownership of the need to advance diversity. A CRO may say, we have built the infrastructure necessary to recruit diverse populations, and we are going to sell that idea to the sponsors that engage us, or we're not going to contract with sponsors who aren't interested in diverse recruitment. And finally, it is necessary for individuals along the spectrum of stakeholders to work with one another in a way that I just described, to ensure that interaction and collaboration serve to promote diversity. Next slide. Cutting across a lot of what we'll discuss here is the idea that the need to develop metrics, collect those data, and track progress toward diversity is essential, no matter where in the research enterprise you sit. Similarly, making those data known within your organization, to the public, to your contracting partners, is vital if we are going to be able to identify processes that work, if we're going to be able to take credit for the good work we do, and if we're going to be able to motivate those within our organization and elsewhere to make change. And then finally, once we have metrics and those metrics are made known, we allow ourselves to be accountable both to our own organization and to the public at large for the goals of diversity. And accountability, I think, is critical. We've talked about this before. Federal regulatory agencies in the US have done an enormous amount of work now for decades to encourage and guide investigators toward diversity. However, there isn't a hard mandate right now in the US federal regulations. And so other processes are necessary to motivate. Accountability is vital. We'll talk about some examples of that. Next slide. There are cross-cutting responsibilities that apply to all stakeholder groups. That phone will probably stop ringing eventually. There we go. It's my daily phone call from Walgreens, no doubt. Those cross-cutting responsibilities I'm going to consolidate into 4 notions. One is that it's important to establish diversity as an organizational priority. 2, that an organization should make public commitments to the ideal of diversity. 3, entities in the research enterprise ought to incorporate patient and community perspectives. And then 4, that we need to create expectations or demands and hold accountable others that we interact with along the research pathway. Next slide. We talk about establishing diversity and inclusion as an organizational priority and core value. It means building infrastructure. It means building organization communication channels. It means adequately resourcing an institutional mechanisms to support the ideal of diversity. A core value means that it's an idea that is communicated within the organization and that becomes known to the organization and that it's supported in other ways. Diversity and inclusion are as important as accrual to a sponsor or to a CRO. And that message needs to be loud and clear. And the reasons for it need to be developed in a way that's specific to the organization. Next, organizations should commit to diversity by setting research priorities, providing training and allocating resources to address the needs of understudied and underrepresented groups. Setting research priorities may have to do with designing research, adapting research, and seeking new ideas for research that address the traditionally understudied group. And setting research priorities that are responsive to the often understudied group is a top-down, a concept-down notion of how to improve or address healthcare disparities. The idea of simply recruitment of diverse populations after the fact is better than not doing that at all. But the idea that research should be developed and tailored to the needs of traditionally underrepresented groups is part of this notion of diversity as an institutional value. It's important for institutions big and small to create positions or roles tasked with promoting diversity, and that there needs to be adequate research allocation. Lip service to the idea of an Office of Diversity Planning without real impact is problematic. Organizations, even small ones, need to build some infrastructure to facilitate communication across component functions. So having an office that is a diversity office, that doesn't have a role in engaging with the public, that doesn't have a role in engaging with those involved in drug development, is important. Hold on. It's important to create organization-wide performance standards, metrics, and incentives that encourage and reward progress toward diversity goals. Each employee should understand how they can contribute to the overall cost. And then last, it's important that all organizations begin to measure metrics related to diverse enrollment, whatever those targets are for the organization. Next slide. Public commitments to diversity can take many forms, but the idea of telescoping the organization's intent both sends a message throughout the organization, but sends a message to the public that this is part of our standard and what we believe is important. And this is a model statement of diversity by an organization, which basically says that we are committed to inclusion of diverse populations to better reflect the population for whom treatment is intended. Next slide. Patient engagement is critical to the notion of diversity, not just to the enrollment of diverse populations, but to the design of research and the incorporation of patient and community perspectives. There's different components to it. The patient should be allowed to voice their perspective, so their priorities help reframe the research questions. Study design should be tailored to facilitate implementation, to improve access, enrollment, and retention. And outsiders, the community, should be invited in leadership roles as advisors to help increase organizational accountability. And in this concept, again, the notion is that patient and community groups can hold industry, can hold researchers and facilities accountable to the promises that they make to the community in the process of designing the research and recruiting those populations. Next slide. As I mentioned before, it's vital that the various stakeholders create expectations along the research pathway. Funding agencies should expect reports on diversity and inclusion when they capture accrual data. And institutions and investigators that are successful in accruing subjects, like accomplishing their science goals, should also be held accountable, for example, to recruiting diverse and understudied populations. And this kind of accountability is critical throughout this kind of research pathway, between contract research organizations and industry, between CROs and sites, and between sites and investigators. Creating infrastructure that enables there to be diversity and recruitment, and then tracking that, and then holding the players accountable is what the ultimate aims are. Next slide. 2 more slides. The role of the clinician is also vitally important and often neglected. Clinicians need to recognize their obligation to be familiar with treatments in development, which may be better for their patients. Clinicians also need to be sensitive to implicit and explicit bias, which may impact the methods by which they refer their subjects to research or do not. Stakeholders, similarly, need to be mindful of the way that clinical research impacts, sometimes in an unwanted way, the lives, the practices, the roles of the clinician. And in a way, the study team ought to remain engaged with the referring clinician during and following the trial. And study aims, procedures, and eligibility criteria ought to be built in a way that's familiar and appropriate for the clinicians involved. Next slide. The IRB, as I mentioned before, has a vital role. IRBs ensure research is ethical, subject selection is fair, and benefit is optimized. And in the process of asking questions, they create expectations, promote dialogue, and establish accountability. Next slide. And this is, I think, is the final slide. In this whole process, we recognize that there are many players, often not considered stakeholders in the same way. But the medical journals have demonstrated they can have major influence on policy. For example, the requirements for drug trial registration and the requirement for conflict of interest disclosure. Journals can enhance diversity by requiring submission for review of demographic characteristics. They can require authors to comment on generalizability. And lastly, they need to diversify and train their editors, editorial boards, and journal staff so that the process of review and study selection is more open to and sensitive to research involving individuals of color. I'll stop there and hand it off to Fabian. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. That is incredibly way of putting it all in such concise information. One of the things that our organization has is our motto, and basically you've talked about exactly what our motto is. Our motto is the future of medicine starts with you. And who is you? I always say you, there's 3 in this little triad of you. It's you, the providers, you, the sponsor, and you, the patient, right? If those 3 individuals are not together, there is no future in medicine. And now we expand this future of medicine to what is happening in diversity. And that really hones into the need that we all have together as a collaborative to push this forward. And I just want to give you a little bit of background of who we are and where we are with this. So like it says on my slide deck here, right, I'm the CEO Research Director of Emerson Clinical Research Institute, which is based here in Washington, D.C., and we serve patients from Baltimore all the way down to Northern Virginia that come to us, and of course D.C. So can I just have the first slide, and I'm going to give you a little background of who we are, where we are. All right, so here we are. It's the Emerson Diversity Health Foundation, Research Institute, and Community Clinic. And basically, the Research Institute started first because my focus was to bring these clinical trial opportunities to patients who otherwise had no access to clinical trials because they weren't aware that it even exists. After that, we had to start a community clinic, even though we have our partner organizations where patients are coming from, and we're recruiting them from these different locations. Some of our partner clinics did not have the capacity to hold on to some of our new patients that we had found through marketing. So we had to start a little community clinic so that they could have a safety net clinic, a medical home for their basic care once they were done with the studies. I didn't want to just say goodbye, thank you for being in the study, if they didn't have a place to go. And then lastly, we had the foundation, which really does a lot of outreach and education. So can we go to the next slide? So here's where we are, our locations, DC, Virginia, Maryland. I think part of our success is the fact that we also open on Saturdays and on Sundays if we have to. I was shocked, and I still am surprised when sponsors ask me, or I let them know that we open on Saturdays. It's like this whole new concept for them. And you know, everyone needs to open on Saturdays. If you want to help our diverse population, our patients who don't have a regular 9-to-5 job, who can't take leave, and need to have extra time, Saturdays really helps patients come through. And we open early on Saturdays, right? At 7:30, we're already drawing blood to make sure patients come in. We sometimes get there at 6 if we have to. 5:30, I've been there as early as 5:30 to help patients out to come through. We provide no-cost transportation for patients, so I have to beg and plead sponsors to recognize the importance of allowing a little bit of extra budget for those patients that need it. It's important to remember that. It's those patients that need transportation. It's not for everyone. So I say it to sponsors so that they realize it's not going to really inflate the budget. It's just something that we need to do so that patients have that extra option to get to work on time or to go home and take care of their kids. So by having transportation has really allowed us to increase our patient satisfaction and increasing compliancy with patients. So I don't care about their legal status, and I don't care about their insurance status. And I tell them that up front on all the recruitment, all the stuff that we do on social media. When they call our office, we tell them, we don't care, we just want to help you. Next slide. So our foundation really works to provide this community outreach and education. And we do this by several ways. We work very closely with the consulates of Mexico, Guatemala, and El Salvador. Through the Mexican consulate, our foundation actually receives this yearly small grant, which allows me to have someone 5 days a week at the consulates in the morning at the Mexican consulate, educating people on health awareness, and clinical trials. And then we also are able to refer them to other clinics where they can receive care free or at reduced cost, regardless as to where they are, because patients, or in this case, people come to the consulate from as far as Delaware, West Virginia. So that is pretty far away. So they may not be qualified to come into one of our clinic or research studies, but we can help them get access to health or research somewhere else. So every day I have someone from 8 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. at the Mexican consulate, because those are the times when it's packed. After that, then they do the logistics and coordinating and report back to the consulate what our findings were, because we also do some other screenings there. And then we do the similar activities at Guatemala and El Salvador. Unfortunately, I can't have someone there every day because we don't have the funding to provide that, but I do have someone there at least one day a week at each of those consulates. Part of that outreach is also the screenings that we do. If you see there, we do diabetes screenings, we do ophthalmology screenings, we do the basics, blood, height and weight. We actually even do urine screenings for UTIs in women, because we're also doing one of those studies. And then we refer patients because they don't even know that they're having a UTI. Part of that education and continued outreach is our TV show. I am blessed to say that we have been on air. We're going to be on 3 years. And yes, we did win an Emmy. It's amazing what you can do with the drive and dedication and the limited teamwork that we have to produce a really valuable TV show. It's awesome, it's exciting. It's half an hour every Saturday morning on Telemundo. We reach about 60,000 viewers every Saturday morning. Plus then we upload the information, our shows on social media. So we are on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Our website has our TV show. The YouTube channel has all of our shows on there. They're half an hour. It's really exciting. So if you are as our viewers now on this presentation, if you have a topic that you think it's interesting and important for us to tell our communities, please let me know, because the goal is to provide that awareness. The TV show is half an hour. We talk about disease and we take it apart. What happens in our community? We talk to community leaders. We talk to experts in the field. We talk about the clinical research that's going on around it and how they can participate. And then there's a section called Ask the Doc. It's really, really exciting show. We've had, FDA, CDC, NIH, other medical associations participate in it. And then we do health fairs if we have to. I mean, now with COVID, it's kind of been a little bit of a challenge. Our sites, like I said, it's DC. Now we are just starting our new location in New Jersey. It was Passaic. Now we moved it to West New York, New Jersey. Funny enough, I actually kind of grew up around that area, so it was nice to kind of go back to see that we're going to open up a clinic there. Once again, gigantic, diverse population, and that's our goal, is to be in those communities, just like we are in DC, just like we are in Falls Church, Virginia. We are where our patients are. Next slide. Our community clinic, right? We do basic care, labs, physical exams, vaccines, family health, and those are the treatments that we give our patients. Within the Research Institute, we see patients from 7 and above in immunology, ophthalmology, primary care, men's health, women's health, metabolic disease. Of course, we're doing our COVID research trials. And that is kind of where we kind of put it all together. So no matter where a patient lands, if it's in the foundation, if it's the community clinic, or if it's in the Research Institute, they will have the opportunity to touch all of these areas and receive support, receive help, which is fundamental to including our diverse patients in our clinical trials. It is not it is our everyday living that we have in my office, that all of our patients are coming from a diverse background, and we prove it time and time again that if we talk to our patients and the value of it, it works, and patients trust us and they come. We actually just started a radio show that is now Wednesday mornings, today at 9 a.m. And we have a half an hour within a larger radio show to talk about health, to really expand on the topic. And that is what's important. We are always in the eyes of the community and now in the ears of the community, knowing that we are a trusted organization doing something for them. And patients call us without hesitation of fears that something is going to happen to them, and they're learning to trust, and they're learning the value of being in a clinical trial. I think that's my last slide. I think I might have one more. That's it. Chris, I will hand the baton over to you, my friend.
All right. Thanks, Fabian. And thank you to the MRC team for having me here today. We can go to the next slide. All right, we can go even further up. All right. Well, a few years ago, I was talking with a community leader about clinical trials and how to improve participation among patients in the community, particularly underrepresented patients, Black, Brown. And one of the things she said that stuck in my mind was that sometimes a clinical trial can feel a little bit like the Olympics coming to town. The organization, she said, or the organizing committee comes in to do something that they say will be good for the community. But when it's all said and done, the community isn't really any better off than it was before. Excuse me. Now, of course, this isn't a perfect analogy, but it does get at the main issue that we're seeing with diversity in clinical trials: trust over time. Next slide, please. At Takeda, like many pharma companies, we have teams that look after all of the operational aspects of our clinical trials, including things like patient recruitment and diversity. But we wanted to go further and look at diversity in clinical trials from a different perspective in a more holistic way. So not just as an operational problem or a recruitment problem, but from the community perspective. So we asked ourselves, can our clinical trials actually help to improve the situation in our communities? So we ended up putting in place a Center for Health Equity, and we embedded it within our R&D organization to work with our R&D teams and community partners to build scientific and technical capacity that can, yes, help with diversity in clinical trials, but more importantly, that can help strengthen the overall healthcare system in the community and help address some of the social determinants of health that you see here on this slide. Next slide, please. The framework and strength of our capacity building approach is really multi-sector collaborations. This includes collaborations and partnerships with organizations that R&D and clinical trial teams in pharma don't typically work with, such as NGOs like Fabian's, nonprofits, and other community-based organizations. These partners are critical because they know what is needed in the community, and they've earned the trust of the community over decades. In this way, we don't fall into the trap of going into underserved communities with a, we know what you need, and here's how to fix it approach. Instead, working through our partners, we learn what the community has already done, where it wants to focus next, and what the gaps and barriers are. This kind of knowledge sharing collaboration can be unusual for both the R&D part of the company and the community partners at first. Most communities don't have relationships with the R&D part of a pharma company, or they're used to more typical transactional relationships where the company foundation or the corporate social responsibility group gives a grant, but doesn't really engage much beyond that. Next slide. Through our programs, we're not only sharing expertise and skills that are essential for running clinical trials, but that can also be used before and after the trial to strengthen the system and improve patient care more sustainably. Good examples of this are helping to set up patient database systems or PCR research capabilities that may be essential for a clinical trial, but they can also be used to support communities' response to COVID-19, for example. Next slide. Through our R&D Center of Health Equity, we now have over 50 programs with 20 partners focused on building technical and scientific capacity in underserved communities. One of our longer-term collaborative projects, in fact, has been with the Harvard Medical School, the NGO Partners in Health, and their local affiliate in Haiti, Zanmi Lasante, to strengthen research capacity that can be used to address the country's mental health crisis, as well as support the conduct of clinical and basic research over time. And as you can see here on this slide, we have similar programs in places like Sub-Saharan Africa. Many of the hospitals and clinics we're working at are not clinical trial sites now, but could be ready soon. So while these programs focus on different communities, both in the US and abroad, focus on different disease areas and span from basic research to clinical research capacity building, they all have in common a focus on training and empowering minority researchers so that they can participate in and lead clinical and basic research and also help improve patient care in their communities long term. So thank you, and I'll turn it back over to Richardae for the Q&A.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers for the extremely informative presentations, and it's great to hear all the work that you all have been doing to advance clinical trial diversity and health equity. So to kick off our question and answer session, I wanted to raise the first question to Fabian. So Fabian, can you share some information with us about some of the challenges that you've experienced within your work, and especially at the provider or staff level?
So I think the challenges that we see in some of our protocols is something as simple as waiting for a consent in Spanish. It is such a low-hanging fruit that sponsors need to immediately, as soon as they have a study that they're going to do, have it included as a standard document to have a consent in Spanish. The other challenge that I have is that patients, when I talk to them about a clinical trial, especially in our communities, are shocked when I tell them what they're going to receive and why and how, and they're even going to get a little compensation for their time. So it's the challenge of ensuring we continue to educate the community on why they're doing it. And as soon as they have that education understood, they're all in, ma'am. As soon as they know 100% of the patients are like, I get it, I see the value, and I see what I should do it. So those are the challenges that I see. And then the challenge overall from what I see on the other sponsor side is that a lot of sponsor companies will want to do this diversity initiative, but they understaff the mission. They provide maybe one person as an added on responsibility to focus on diversity, but then they don't have time because they do other things. And it's a team of one, or it's a team of a FTE of 0.5. So if they're really going to do it, if sponsors really want to do it, they need to put a few people on there. If I can have 12 people in my staff, sponsors could have at least 5 people running diversity.
Thanks, Fabian. That is a really good point. And just to kind of continue that conversation and thinking about some of the challenges, Chris, can you provide some information about maybe any of the challenges that you've experienced within your company or externally with those that you've engaged with?
Yeah, thanks, Richardae. And first, I want to follow up on what Fabian was saying about having these dedicated resources within sponsor companies to address these issues. I wholeheartedly support that. Obviously, we've been trying to do that over the last several years. We have dedicated groups that focus on the operational aspects of recruiting diverse patients into trials. We have separate group focused on patient engagement at all aspects of the clinical development program, as David was saying. And then also now my team with the Health Equity Center, really looking more holistically at this. So I am on the phone constantly talking to my counterparts at other companies saying, you need to do this. And I think the message is getting through. So that is one challenge, being resourced, having companies start to make this a priority, which I think they are doing. We're certainly doing that at Takeda. One of the challenges to your question about working more closely with the community is that this is a new way of working, right? So as I said in the presentation, the part of the company that may typically work with a nonprofit or an NGO like Fabian's or someone else may be a foundation or corporate social responsibility. So that relationship has existed for years, decades. So when you have an R&D group come in and say, we want to work with you kind of hand in hand and with the local clinic or hospital, we want to be on the ground in the centers, training and helping you build capacity. The first look we get is kind of a strange look of, okay, that's new. So that's been one of the challenges, but it goes back to trust and time, right? So these initiatives don't happen over, a year or two. A lot of these programs and partners we have, it's 5, 6 years, and have just built that foundation of trust.
Thanks, Chris. And, David, of course, I'm coming to you next. And thanks so much for highlighting, where you are currently, and of course, understanding your wealth of experience, especially with IRBs. I just kind of wanted to bring that to you next. And I, of course, have heard you talk about this, but can you share just your thoughts when we talk about clinical trial diversity? What are your thoughts with that with regard to IRBs?
Well, my feeling is that that IRBs are tasked with addressing and ensuring adherence to the notion of justice in subject selection, and also optimizing the benefits of the research. And I think those two ethical mandates, among others, require them to pay attention to the demographics of the proposed research sample, and also the demographics of the sample as it's accrued over time during continuing review. So the idea that an IRB wouldn't even ask for the racial, ethnic, age, and sex breakdown is problematic. But even once they have that information in hand, I think it obliges the IRB to have an interaction or engage the investigator and say, why have you selected a uniformly white population in your study? And what efforts have you made to engage the community? And is there a scientific justification for what you did? And can you do better? So I think that as part of what is, I think, often an under-recognized and underappreciated role for the IRB, deliberating on inclusion, I think, is a core ethical value that IRBs ought to be involved with.
Thank you, David. And I want to bring up one of the questions that we received in the Q&A. So I'm going to read this to our panelists and welcome any of you to answer it and jump in and address it. So the question is that some caregivers have raised concerns about generalizability of access and outcomes compared to outcomes access seen from specialized research centers, from new platforms, especially cell and gene therapies. Please expand about options, best practices to expand the access and outcomes of such new, highly complex but promising platforms.
I'm happy to jump in on this. I think it's an incredibly important question, and it really focuses, as medicine is getting more personalized, we're starting to use gene therapies. The issue of having diversity in those pivotal trials is critical, right? So we're still trying to, most of the trials that we're doing are focusing on, medicines that are not quite personalized just yet, but that's changing rapidly. So it's critically important to do that. The answer is multifactorial. I think there isn't one angle to this. Everything we've talked about in 3 presentations, I think, is critical. Building infrastructure within the sponsor companies that are doing the research, putting in, as David said, concrete measures that teams, individual study teams who run the research are being held accountable to, and can use those as guides to remind them to do this, as well as those partnerships with community-based organizations for the pull-through. And really the understanding of this research, because that's going to be key. As the medicines get more complex, the understanding of why this is important for my community to participate will become more complicated as well. So we're going to need those partnerships to be able to explain that in more detail. So those are my thoughts on that, but love to hear what David and Fabian have to say.
The only thing that I want to add to that, and I think it's a very important point, is that truly personalized medicine also needs to account for the environment in which the individual lives and the circumstances in which they live. And while genes and biology may have profound implications for treatment effect and outcome, so does the environment and sometimes the culture in which they live. And not paying attention to all of those things, particularly in traditionally understudied or special populations in certain ways, I think will do a disservice ultimately to those populations and to the science.
Yeah, I'll leave it at that. I mean, it was very well put.
And Fabian, another question has come in that specifically wants to know more about your show on To Salud, To Familia. And one of the questions, you talked about broader health education. Have you also been able to bring the discussion of clinical trial diversity and clinical trial education to that platform?
So in every show, we mention, every single show has a segment called Advances in Medicine, right? So clinical research. So every single show, I talk to people about why they should participate, how they can get involved, what is the difference between current treatment and the research that's being developed, so that they understand why it's important to participate in. Our Emmy that we won, actually, on that TV show, I went back and even talked, as we closed the show, talked about the Nuremberg trials and what was happening there, and why was the Code of Federal Regulation put together? Why is that important? What are the principles of ethics that surround research? But I think the next show that we need to do is really breaking down a little bit more of it, so that people understand what is an IRB, that they didn't even know that an IRB exists, right? So that will give people that sense of, it's okay. So there's other people besides big pharma kind of doing these studies, and that there is a committee put together, and that they do have a place where they can kind of go and complain about the staff and this PI and everything. So ma'am, it's a very good point. And I think we need to expand on that TV show to dedicate it on that whole process.
Thank you so much, Fabian. And I'm looking at the time. I know we're kind of right here wrapping up and close to the noon hour. So I guess I just want to open it just for our panelists to maybe leave our audience with just one final thought. When we think about stakeholder roles and responsibilities, what is the one thing that you want everyone to remember from our session today?
So I can go first, and I can be very bluntly and honestly and say to everyone, put your money where your mouth is. If you say you're going to do diversity, do it. If you want to work with organizations, work with them. I want to encourage all of you, if you are a site, to make sure you tell your sponsors where you're getting your patients from, that you are doing an effort to reach the community, to educate the community. It's so important. And for sponsors to reach out to those sites and work with them, give us a shot. Just because that site may not have done that particular therapeutic area, we have the patients. We're the ones that see the patients. Try not to be so close-minded, and open up the vision to the fact that we can help increase this diversity role. It's so important. And the last thing is, if you want to work with us directly, I'm going to put a little pun on your little request. Our foundation is always in need to keep our TV show alive and bring these consulates to more. So if there's an opportunity for us to work together, I'm open to any suggestions that you have. But once again, let's do it. Let's keep this needle moving forward, because we're in the right track.
Yeah, I just follow on Fabian's theme there, which I think is partnerships, right? There's no one stakeholder group who can solve this challenge on their own. So we need to work together. And then, as David was saying, focus, it's really beyond medicine, right? I think it's a more holistic approach to solving the health disparities in our communities, our underrepresented, underserved communities, needs to be part of the equation. Not just the efficacy and safety of the medicines, but the more holistic look. How are we improving overall healthcare in those communities? It's not just one thing. So I think that would be my message. David?
Let me just say that the MRCT guidance document on diversity and inclusion, it includes far more information than we could ever imagine to cover, either in a single webinar or a webinar series. And a lot of blood, sweat, and tears went into it. So take a look at it, and remember, it's a work in progress. And so share with the MRCT Center your successes and failures and bright ideas, because we hope to build on that document and build on the community of people that are working together to make these kinds of changes. But thank you all.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David. Thank you, Chris. And thank you, Fabian. We also thank our audience and the participants today. And of course, the recording from our panel session today will be live on the MRCT website. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
All right.
Thank you.